We have been working through a series on the life of King David, and we're going to finish it up today. So you are here for the grand finale. Everybody that's not here, they missed it, so they'll have to get the recording. But in this series that we've been going through, we've been looking at the life of David, and it's one of the most. He's got one of the most well-documented lives in Scripture. A whole big section of the Bible goes to describing the life of King David and gives us a lot of information, a lot of stories, a lot of things like that. And so we've learned a lot of things about David. And one of the first things we learned was that he's a man after God's own heart. And there are a lot of things he did. You know, he killed the giant. He led the troops in battle. Was esteemed in a lot of these different ways. And but knowing that he trusted God with everything. It says he trusted God with his heart, soul, mind, and strength, with everything that he was. He trusted God. That's what it means to be a man after God's own heart. But we learned that even though he was this godly man, that he was no stranger to sin. He was no stranger to mistakes. And he was certainly no stranger to the consequences that go with both of those things. And last week we were talking about, besides the story of when David killed Goliath, the second most famous, I guess, well-known story about the life of David was his sin with Bathsheba. And so we talked about that last week, and we talked about, his adultery with Bathsheba and his murderous actions against her husband Uriah. And we saw that the consequences that he faced for that were great. Not only did he and Bathsheba's child die, but then God kind of pronounced upon him this, I don't know if curse is the right word, but basically pronounced upon him this prophecy that violence would always mar his house and his family, that violence would follow his family for the rest of the time. And that's some pretty stiff consequences. But David had a lot of great successes, though. He had great successes as a king, but he had some great failures as a man, as a husband, as a father. And when we think about that word success, though, because he did have some great successes, but we think about that, we think, well, what does that really mean? What does that word success really mean? Especially in the world that we live in today. How do we think about success? Is it wealth? Is it power? Is it prestige? Is it some kind of position that we hold? Is that the mark of a man or a woman? The prestige, the power, and those kind of things. Is that what's really the most important thing? Because if that's the case, then we would say that David was a huge success because of all the things that he was able to accomplish. But what about our responsibility to the others that are around us? Especially to our children and the legacy that we leave behind through them. What about that? See, although David was very successful in building the kingdom of Israel, it said there was no greater king. He beat back their enemies. He filled their coffers with wealth. He secured these great favorable trade deals. He earned the respect of all the neighboring nations. All these different things. He was very successful in all those things, but then he dropped the ball when it came to most of his children. He really dropped the ball at that point when it came to most of his children. Remember, David had many wives. He had several. We know of 8 that the Bible mentions. He had many wives. He had many children with those wives, and This is kind of a problem. Most of the children, though, because he had many wives, he had many children with those wives, most of those children were only half brothers and sisters to each other. So they had the same father, but they did not have the same mother. And, this would have made it very difficult to be a good father. And it's certainly, one of the practical reasons why God, and we read this last week, where God said he told the kings not to have many wives. Certainly one of the practical reasons behind that is because of just the difficulty of having all these half-brothers and sisters. And those of you that have experienced a blended family, you know the difficulties that go along with a blended family, with trying to bring 2 families together and how hard that is. It's It's not impossible, but it's certainly very difficult. Well, in David's family, it was extremely difficult because not only were they half brothers and sisters and they didn't all live in the same place all the time, and it was extremely difficult because these children grew up with a lot of privilege. They lived very privileged lives. They were children of the king. So who's going to tell them no? Who's going to tell them that they can't have something? Or you can imagine what that would be like. And probably had very little parental supervision. We can certainly pick up on that from Scripture. And so they grew up to be very spoiled and very contentious people from childhood. So take, for example, Amnon. This is David's oldest son. David's oldest son, he fell in love, or actually it'd be better to call it lust, with his half-sister Tamar, David's daughter from another wife. Now that's disturbing enough as it is, but it gets worse because Amnon wanted Tamar, but she wouldn't give him the time of day. Basically wouldn't have anything to do with him. So he concocted a plan. He concocted this plan that he was going to pretend to be sick, and he was going to be in his house, he was going to pretend to be sick, and then he requested of David to send Tamar to him to fix a meal, to help him feel better, and all that kind of stuff. And so here's what happened. With that in mind, 2 Samuel 13, we're going to read verses 10 through 22. So David sent Tamar to him. Then Amnon said to Tamar, "Bring the food into the chamber that I may eat from your hand." And Tamar took the cakes she had made and brought them into the chamber to Amnon her brother. But when she brought them near to him to eat, he took hold of her and said to her, "Come, lie with me, my sister." She answered him, "No, my brother, do not violate me, for such a thing is not done in Israel. Do not do this outrageous thing. As for me, where can I carry my shame? And as for you, you would be as one of the outrageous fools in Israel. Now, therefore, please speak to the king, for he will not withhold me from you." But he would not listen to her. Being stronger than she, he violated her and lay with her. Then Amnon hated her with very great hatred, so that the hatred with which he hated her was greater than the love with which he had loved her. And Amnon said to her, "Get up, go." But she said to him, "No, my brother, for this is wrong, and sending me away is greater than the other that you did to me." But he would not listen to her. He called the young man who served him and said, "Put this woman out of my presence and bolt the door after her." Now she was wearing a long robe with sleeves, for thus were the virgin daughters of the king dressed. So his servant put her out and bolted the door after her. And Tamar put ashes on her head and tore the long robe that she wore, and she laid her hand on her head and went away, crying aloud as she went. And her brother, Absalom, said to her, "Has Amnon your brother been with you? Now hold your peace, my sister. He is your brother. Do not take this to heart." So Tamar lived, a desolate woman, in her brother Absalom's house. When King David heard of all these things, he was very angry. But Absalom spoke to Amnon neither good nor bad, for Absalom hated Amnon because he had violated his sister Tamar. How horrible. I mean, how tragic. This sexual assault and mistreatment of Tamar is proof that Amnon never really loved her. We hear about, assaults of this kind. This is, the Me Too movement that's going on in the United States and around the world, and we hear about these kind of things, and we hear the advice that her brother gives to her, and I just kind of shake my head, and it's like, that's not how you deal with these things. But you may ask, what does this have to do with David? What does this have to do with David? Because I thought we were talking about David, and here we are talking about his children. Well, that's kind of the point. It's kind of the point of all this. David is conspicuously absent. He's conspicuously absent from these affairs at a time when David should have been stepping up to be a leader in his own family. We find that he's kind of disappeared. He dropped the ball. He ducked his head. He avoided the situation. I mean, the only thing it says about David in this is that he was very angry. He was very angry. But what did he do? Nothing. He didn't do anything about it. Why was he so weak? I mean, this is clearly wrong. I don't think anybody can see this and say, well, no, this was okay. No, this is clearly wrong, but he did nothing. He was weak. So how is it that David could be this great leader in the army? He could be great at leading the nation, and yet be so terrible at leading his own family? Could it have something to do with his own sin? Could it have something to do with the things that he knows from his past, that he maybe felt like, well, I don't have any, moral high ground on which to stand here to tell them how they should live their lives after the mistakes that I've made, after the sins that I've committed. I've made such grave errors and sins in my life that I can't tell them what they should do with their lives. But here's the thing. Our responsibility for teaching our children God's ways does not disintegrate when we sin or make mistakes. It does not go away in those times. It does not disintegrate when we make our mistakes. That does not absolve us from the fact that we still have to raise our children, that we still have to teach them right from wrong. If anything about the mistakes that we make, we can use those times as teaching moments. If anything, we can use those times as teaching moments for our children. We can use as a teaching moment by owning up to our own sin, by showing them what that means, to show them how you can be repentant, to ask for forgiveness, showing the way of moving on, following a grave sin, and following the Lord afterwards, to show the way. But that's not what David really did here. But this was more than just an immoral act. This was a crime. This was criminal. I mean, very strong action should have been taken by David the king, if not by David the father. But again, we see that David seems to have a blind spot when it comes to his family. He seems to have a blind spot about what he should be doing. But if David the king had taken a stand at this point, if he had done something as he should have done, then maybe the next part of the story wouldn't have happened the way that it happened, because we're not done yet. 2 years go by, and Absalom, Tamar's brother, David's son, has not even spoken to Amnon even once in 2 years. Now, I don't know how rare that was. I don't know how big of a deal that was. I don't know if they spoke to each other a lot before, but for 2 years they didn't speak at all. But he hasn't forgotten what Amnon did. And it says in the verse there that we just read, the passage, that he hated Amnon. Well, 2 years go by. He hasn't spoken to him, but he hasn't forgotten. What he's been doing is he's been planning. He's been plotting. We see that Absalom is a planner. He's a plotter. He's one of these guys that thinks it all out ahead of time. He's been plotting. He's been planning revenge. And by waiting 2 years, he is serving it up ice cold. I mean, that's what they say, right? Revenge is a dish best served cold. Well, 2 years later, it's cold now. And here's the deal. Absalom planned this dinner party for all the royal brothers to come to his house and to eat. For all of his brothers to come, and he pressed on his father David. Because, see, he and Amnon have no relationship. So he presses on his father David to make sure that Amnon shows up. Because chances are he probably wouldn't. So he presses on David, makes sure that Amnon is there. And so David, and possibly even Amnon at this point, are thinking, well, they may have thought, well, after 2 years, maybe Absalom's cooled off. Maybe at this point, he's ready to forgive and forget. Maybe at this point, Absalom is ready to bury the hatchet. Well, he was ready to bury the hatchet, but the problem is that he buried the hatchet in Amnon. He buried the hatchet in Amnon. That's what he did, because he got there, had all the brothers there, he got Amnon there, they ate, they had a good time, got Amnon good and drunk, and then he said to his servants, kill him. And they did. Revenge accomplished. Done. But now Absalom's got a problem, because now he's killed the king's son. In fact, he killed the oldest son. He killed the one that was next in line, really, for the throne. And so he knows that he's done a bad thing, and so he gets up and he runs. He runs off to live with his grandfather in Geshur. For 3 years he goes and lives there. And again, David does nothing. Nothing. Not a thing. David didn't do a thing. Didn't come after him. And this is murder. This is straight up murder. To think that David's got a blind spot about his family, yeah, he's got a blind spot, all right. And no backbone at all about it. So he does nothing. We're definitely seeing a trend in his parenting style. Basically, the idea is just ignore the problem and hope that it goes away. Well, does that ever work? I mean, does that work in your life? Does that work in your family? Just ignore the problem and hope it goes away? I mean, that may have worked when the kids were younger a little bit, when the consequences weren't quite so great, but as adults, these children have gone off the deep end, and now David is reaping what he has sown. He's reaping the results of the way that these children were raised, and that's not the end of it. That's not even the end of the story, because see, 3 years later, he's been gone for 3 years, living with his grandfather. Now David is finally, after being pressed upon again by others, he's finally willing to allow Absalom to come home. After 3 years, he says, yes, he can come home. And he does. But he won't speak to him. He says he can come home, but he can't come into my presence. I won't talk to him. He can't come to the palace. He can't come to me. Yes, he can come home, but he's really no son of mine. I won't talk to him at all. It seems like he's being a bit petulant about this. He should have been dealing with it, but instead, he's just being the way he's being. So David is still, again, ignoring the problem instead of dealing with it. He's just ignoring it. And this goes on for 2 more years, where Absalom is living in the city, he's living in Jerusalem, and David doesn't speak to him, and then finally, he allows Absalom to come into his presence and to talk to him again. David, basically, the way that it reads in Scripture, it doesn't really even say that David said anything. It said it kissed him on the head and then let him go. Just kind of a way of saying, all right, off you go. But here's the deal. Do you remember when I told you that Absalom was a planner? That Absalom was a plotter? Well, he's still doing that. Because see, Absalom has spent the last 2 years that he's been living there in the city, and he's been getting to know a lot of people. Basically, he set up shop at the city gates. And when people would come in to see the king, he would say, boy, it's a shame that you can't go see the king. It's a shame that he doesn't, if I were in charge, that I would give you justice for what you come here for today. I would give you what you needed if you had come to me. But, the king's not going to see you, so sorry, I guess you're just out of luck. So he spent his time these 2 years, and he ingratiated himself with his people. He's working angles. He's plotting, he's planning, he's conspiring until the time was finally right, and he initiated a rebellion against his father. So he took a portion of the army, and he took them out of the city, and then he was turning back around with his army, coming back into the city to take the city, to take Jerusalem, to take the throne. And this is Absalom coming back in. And you could say, like the chickens coming home to roost. Well, here it is. All the things that David has been kind of putting aside, that he's been ignoring, well, here it is knocking on his door. And so what does David do? Well, you would think, as a good king, he'd strap on his sword and he'd lead the army out there and that they would fight and they'd settle this thing. But no, that's not what David does. What David did instead was he didn't want to fight his son. He didn't want to fight in Jerusalem and have Jerusalem burnt to the ground. So he packed up a bag, took some of his army, some of his men, and he left the city, and he left the throne to Absalom. Abdicated. Now, Absalom is king. Absalom is king in Jerusalem. He is king of Israel, but he's not satisfied with that. He knows that David's still out there. He knows he's going to have to deal with that at some point. And see, at least Absalom is to the point where he says, I've got a problem, I've got to deal with it. So he gets his army, and they go out, and he sets out to kill David. He sets out to kill the men that are with him. And so they go out into the wilderness, and so there's this huge battle, and during the course of the battle, Absalom is killed. All the men who were with him go back to their homes. Rebellion's over. So David goes back to the city, back to Jerusalem, back to his throne, mourning his son Absalom. But again, you just can't help but wonder, did it all have to happen this way? Is this the way it had to happen? David went on to live many more years, and he eventually died, and he eventually did give his throne to one of his sons. We're going to get to that in a second, but did it have to turn out this way? I mean, could this have been avoided? Could all this have been avoided had David not sinned, first of all, with Bathsheba, the time when God told him that the sword would never leave his home, that the sword would never leave his family? Could that have changed things? Could it have been avoided if he had been a more present, if he had been a more involved father? Could things have been different? I believe so. I believe things would have been completely different. See, here's the thing. We, as parents and grandparents, we have a limited opportunity. We have a limited opportunity to be a godly influence on our children and our grandchildren. And we must not waste it. We have a limited amount of time. And man, I've noticed this as my kids have grown up. I got one that just turned 11, but I've got 23 and 20 years old as well. And I've been watching them grow up. And, you have a limited amount of time with which you can invest in them where they're still really listening. There's a portion of time where they quit listening, and then as they get a little bit older, sometimes they start listening again. But there's a portion of time where they just quit listening completely. But we can't waste the time that we've got. Parents, grandparents, I urge you, don't waste the opportunity that you've got. But it appears that David may have finally understood. Maybe it took all of these horrible things happening in his family for him to finally come around and finally realize what he had done wrong in the first place, what he had done with the others. And so he finally seems like he learned his lesson when it came to his son Solomon. I guess it's true that it's better late than never, but so much better that we would learn the lesson in the first. We don't have a lot of information about David and Solomon's time together. David was older when Solomon was born, but we don't know if they played catch or whether David taught him to play the harp or if they spent a lot of time, camping trips and things like that. We have no idea. We really don't know. The Bible doesn't tell us about that, but we do know that Solomon was chosen by God to be David's successor, that he was chosen by God to be the next king in Israel. And he was also chosen by God to build the temple that God would not allow David to build. So we know there's some special things about Solomon, and we get to hear David's final address to Solomon in Scripture. His final words of advice for a son. His final words of wisdom from a loving father to a son. And these are some good words with which to leave him. And I think it's good words for us today as well. Over in 1 Chronicles 28 It says this, David speaking, he says, "And you, Solomon, my son, know the God of your father and serve him with a whole heart and with a willing mind. For the Lord searches all hearts and understands every plan and thought. If you seek him, he will be found by you. But if you forsake him, he will cast you off forever. Be careful now, for the Lord has chosen you to build a house for the sanctuary. Be strong and do it." Serve him. Seek him. Be careful. Be strong. First thing he told him was to know the Lord. He told Solomon to know the Lord. Now that seems like a kind of an obvious thing, almost maybe too obvious to state. Yes, we should know God. But as a king, David knew some things. He knew about the tyranny of the urgent. You ever heard that phrase before, the tyranny of the urgent? We all have those things that crowd in on us, that pull us at us from every direction. It's all the things that pop up that make you I have to do this, I have to do this, I have to do this. And so you don't have time to do the things that you know that you should. The things with your children, spending time with the Lord. And that's what he's talking about here, is he knows about this tendency to get so busy with things that have to be done. We think they have to be done. To get so busy with things that have to be done right away that we neglect the Lord in our lives. And so he's telling him to know God, to spend time at that. See, knowing God, getting to know him intimately, it requires time and it requires effort on our part. It says to seek him. Requires time, requires effort. See, here's the thing. God is always there for us. God doesn't sleep. God doesn't go on vacation. God doesn't put his phone on silent. Those of you that try to get hold of your teenagers or something like that and they've got their phone on silent, you understand what I'm saying? God doesn't do that. God is always there. So here's the thing. If we don't spend time in prayer, if we don't spend time studying his word, if we don't spend time in private worship and meditation and getting to know God, well, it's not his fault. It's ours. It's our fault if we don't do it. It takes some time. It takes some effort on our part, and it's important to get to know God well. Because when we know him and understand him better, then we will know him and we'll know what's important to him. We'll know the things about him. We'll hear his heart, and we will love him more. And we will represent him better to the world that's around us. The more that we know him, the more that we love him, the better we represent him. It's important to know the Lord. Ephesians 3:17 through 19 helps us to know what this means, to know God. It says, so that Christ may dwell in your hearts through faith. That he may dwell in your hearts through faith, that you, being rooted and grounded in love, may have strength to comprehend with all the saints what is the breadth and length and height and depth, and to know the love of Christ that surpasses knowledge, that you may be filled with all the fullness of God. That's what it means to know God. And that takes some time, and that takes some effort. It's not something that just you snap a finger and it happens. It takes some time. It takes some effort. But then next, David told Solomon to serve the Lord with his whole heart and with a willing mind. To serve the Lord. Serving the Lord with our whole heart means to be undivided in our loyalty and our commitment to him. To be undivided, holding nothing back. Are you undivided in your loyalty and commitment to Christ? Or are there other things that pull against you? We need to be undivided. Serving him with a willing mind means to do the things of God, not because he forces us to, or not even because we feel like we have some obligation to it, but because we want to, because we find joy in serving God. And if you have spent time in serving God, then you will see that there is great joy in it. I watched this week, Vacation Bible School, as our leaders walked away from the last day. They were dragging a bit, I'm not going to lie. But they all had smiles on their faces. And this is from the teachers to the helpers to the kitchen workers to everybody. They all had smiles on their faces because they had been serving the Lord all week, and they saw the joy of serving God through serving these children. When we serve God, we realize that there's great joy in it. When we don't serve Him, we lose sight of that. We forget. So we need to serve Him willingly with joy. Paul talks about this in his letter to the church at Rome in Romans 6. It'll be up on the screen. It says, "But thanks be to God that you who were once slaves of sin have become obedient from the heart." Obedient from the heart to the standard of teaching to which you were committed, and having been set free from sin, have become slaves of righteousness. But obedient from the heart. That's a willingness. That's a love. Serving God willingly with our whole heart. In that verse, it tells us it sets us free from sin and the consequences that come with it. You think David knew a thing or two about that? Absolutely. And he was trying to spare his son from that. We should try to spare our children from that, from the things that we've learned the hard way. But then next, David told Solomon to be careful. I like this. And to be strong as he did all that the Lord told him to do. To be careful and to be strong, particularly in building the temple. Because David knew that was his dream. That's what he wanted to do. And God told him, no, you're not going to get to do that. And he had to deal with the disappointment of that. But knowing that his son was going to do it, that his son was going to build that temple, he told him to be strong. And David knew the reason why he told him this is to be strong and to be careful. David knew that it was easy to get sidetracked. It's real easy to get sidetracked. David spent a good bit of time sidetracked. It was easy to get sidetracked and begin to do things for our glory instead of the glory of God. That's a real tendency with humans, something that we do. We need to be careful. We need to be strong to resist that temptation because pride is a destructive force. Pride is the most destructive thing, really, that Christians will have to deal with. It's a destructive force, and many people who have sought to follow God have failed at this. Many church leaders have failed at this. Many people have failed at this because they allowed pride to get into their hearts, allowed pride to lead them astray. Pride really is the worst enemy of the follower of Christ. See, when we begin to take credit for what we accomplish, when we begin to think or pretend or to even believe that it's in our strength that we do anything, or when we begin to take the credit and we fail to give the glory to God for the things that He's done, we set ourselves up for a fall. Solomon must have certainly understood this. He must have gotten this because later, as he was writing his Proverbs, he wrote a lot about the dangers of pride, including this verse from Proverbs 16, one that most people know. A lot of people know it, but don't even know it comes from the Bible. Pride goes before destruction, and a haughty spirit before a fall. David was a man after God's own heart, but he had pride issues. He wanted to make sure that his son learned that lesson and that he didn't fall into the same traps. See, David's words of wisdom and investment in the life of Solomon paid huge dividends down the line. Paid huge dividends down the line and through the life of Solomon and through the kingdom of God as well. Although Solomon had his problems too. We're not going to go into Solomon's problems because that would take a whole lot. That'd take many more weeks. We're not going to go into all that. He had his problems. He had his hang-ups too. He made his mistakes, but he was still known as the wisest man who ever lived. And he was known as one who followed God. And what more can we ask of our children is that they be one who follows God. Know God, serve him with joy, be strong and careful not to be prideful. This kind of legacy is the best thing that we can pass on to our children, to our grandchildren, to the next generation. So much better than wealth, so much better than financial security or possessions or things like that. What sort of legacy are you passing on to your children, your grandchildren, to the next generation? Because I can tell you this, they are learning something from you. They're learning something from us. The question is what are we teaching them? What are they learning from us? If we're not intentional about it, then they're just going to pick up whatever it is we're laying down. We need to be intentional about it. David had many ups and downs in his life. In his reign as king, he had great successes and he had bitter failures. But through it all, he never took his eyes off the Lord. He never took his eyes off the Lord, and we can learn from such a man. We can learn hope in spite of our humanity. Yes, we're imperfect, but there's hope. We can learn courage even in the midst of our own fear. You think David wasn't scared many times in his life? And yet he had courage. We can learn encouragement and praise despite our hours of despair. If you read through Psalms, you'll read many times that David had times of dark, dark depression and despair. But we can learn praise and encouragement even through that. We can learn forgiveness in our dark times of sin, that we turn to God and God is always there. We can learn the value of serving the purposes of God. And we can pass that on to the next generation as well. So what have you learned through the life of David? What have you learned from God? And what are you passing on to the next generation? Would you pray with me?